Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman, and Washington Post senior national correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Ashley Parker. In terms of politics, Monica, and not to turn this crisis into just a political issue, it's so much more than that. But in terms of politics here at home, because again, this is an election year, the president is facing what really is a no-win situation. You've got progressives who want him to end the war immediately. You've got moderates who want him to at least moderate. And you've got conservatives out there now saying that he should be putting no bars on Israel, no red lines, moderating not at all when it comes to what Israel is doing in Gaza. How is this administration approaching the issue today?
Yeah, you can't ignore the politics here. Certainly, Katie, I think that's fair, but it's the policy really that is driving so much of the politics. And so if there is a potential shift there, that would be really notable. But in terms of the politics here, the president scheduled that call with Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically after those aid workers were killed by those Israeli bombs. And we, of course, know how that phone call went and the commitments that the prime minister made after it from a humanitarian perspective. But we learned today that there was also another reason for the president ramping up his rhetoric and asking Israel to do more. And that was a closed doors, behind the scenes meeting that the president had on Tuesday with some Muslim American community leaders, including some doctors who have been to Gaza, who have been treating extremely gravely injured kids and adults there, who really printed and showed him photos of what people are facing there, that they say the president has been keenly made aware of the situation that he is facing politically because he has lost the support of many in the Arab American and Muslim American communities. And that is crystal clear from the fact that this meeting couldn't take place in a larger fashion related to Ramadan as it has in years past, and because people who were even invited to this meeting flatly declined, saying they didn't want to be seen as coming to the White House to celebrate or have an iftar dinner to break the fast when so many people are facing starvation and on the brink of famine in Gaza. So taking all of that together, you understand that certainly there's an awareness about the political situation, but the White House says repeatedly that that isn't what is driving the policy. But of course, that is the critical background and context to it. And if you look even at our own polling, NBC News polling, specifically taking a look at the president's handling of the Israel and Hamas war, when it comes to young voters who could be critical in this election, when you look at Gen Z and millennials, he is so underwater with those groups that, of course, there is a political reality and awareness to all of that the Biden campaign and the entire reelection effort needs to contend with as well.
What about the personal views on this from the man himself, from the president himself, Ashley? When we're talking about that luncheon that Monica just mentioned, the Breaking the Fast luncheon, that's where we got the reporting that President Biden told an attendee that his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, was urging him to try to stop the war in Gaza. She was saying, stop it now, according to this attendee who heard the president relay that message. What do we know about how the president personally feels about what he's seeing in Israel?
A couple of things. First, just to put what the First Lady was saying in context, it's important to remind people that she does not have an official role, but she is President Biden's closest advisor in any reporting of if he was going to run for president, if he might not run this time. Everyone we talked to close to the Biden orbit and in that orbit said, if anyone can make a difference, if anyone has sway, it's Dr. Jill Biden. And so on this issue, too, you have to keep in mind that her word goes incredibly far. It's also worth noting that the White House has said, look, there's no daylight between the president and the First Lady. She wants this war over, and he wants this war over. He's obviously balancing different considerations. And then to answer the final bit of your question, just speaking broadly, President Biden, going back to his days as a senator, has always been a tremendously staunch supporter of Israel. It's something he feels viscerally. It's something he feels in his bones. And what you see him grappling with now and what members of Congress are saying, what the Democrats are saying, progressives are saying, people in his own party are saying, some of them at least, is it's not mutually exclusive. You can still be a staunch supporter of Israel while criticizing Bibi Netanyahu, for instance. You can still be a staunch supporter of Israel while demanding that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is taken care of. And that seems to be the inflection point we are at.
Also, President Biden came up in an era where Israel's existence was very much at threat. It's different than the generation that is currently coming up, which sees Israel as not a superpower, but as a power and a force in the region, as a strong, powerful country in the Middle East that can defend itself. It's just two different viewpoints on the matter of Israeli statehood. Jake Sherman, let's talk about Congress and how Congress is seeing this, because we've heard from progressives quite a bit on this war and the desire that they've made clear for the president to pull back, to not give so much military aid to Israel. We're now hearing from more moderate members. What are they saying?
Katie, I don't want to overstate this, but it's striking when Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, from Biden's home state, says that we are heading in a direction where there needs to be new restrictions on aid to Israel. That is a sea change for somebody like Chris Coons, who's intimately involved, deeply involved in the global community, and somebody who's very involved in foreign policy and foreign affairs. That's number one. Number two, there's a couple issues at play here. Israel is on autopilot from a deal that was cut during the Obama administration for foreign aid. So Israel does get foreign aid from the United States every year. Congress can change that. It hasn't. I don't think it will. But there's this issue of a supplemental spending bill. Congress has not passed a supplemental spending bill since October 7th to give Israel money. The Senate passed it. It's been languishing in the House of Representatives. There's some signals that Speaker Mike Johnson is going to take it up when he takes up Ukraine aid. Who knows when that is, but in the next several weeks. And the big issue that the Israelis, the Biden administration, and everyone on Capitol Hill needs to contend with is if this bill has to go back to the Senate, if the House changes it, which it's almost certain to do, can Israel aid survive intact as it was passed originally by the Senate? I don't know the answer to that. I think you're going to have a big problem with Democrats who were supportive of Israel on the first round, who are going to go back and say, listen, maybe we need to rethink this. We need to put new restrictions on this. I mean, it's a really big sea change, because originally when conceived, Katie, Israel was the carrot and Ukraine was the more difficult issue to pass on Capitol Hill when it came to aid. Now they're both incredibly difficult, both fraught with challenges. And again, the timetable is really short. This needs to get done pretty soon, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
Monica Alba, what is the what is the reaction from the White House when you're hearing more moderate Democrats speak out? I mean, I think what Jake said, you can't really overstate what it means when Senator Chris Coons comes out and makes a break with precedent on anything with Joe Biden and the Democrats in terms of policy, foreign policy. The two of them are so closely aligned. I mean, Senator Chris Coons is one of President Biden's biggest allies and most supportive voices in Washington, around the country, period.
Absolutely, and one of his greatest confidants. They talk all the time behind the scenes. They are incredibly close, and so it is a notable moment to see Senator Coons, though he has been raising that for some time, as have other moderate Democrats, kind of walking up to this line of, okay, it might soon be time to start conditioning that military aid, but now effectively saying we do need to do that in a more severe manner. But that is why the president says he did come out yesterday and effectively tell Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is the sharpest warning I'm going to give you, and if you don't change course, we aren't going to be behind you in the same way that we have been. But this goes back to Joe Biden, the man who thinks he has the foreign policy chops that he does for years on Israel, thinking that he's right in this position and his approach to Israel, in that his strategy is the closer you hug Israel and keep Prime Minister Netanyahu, the more influence you might be able to have over them. And quite frankly, there's a recognition now that that approach is not obviously working. And there is this complete pressure that the president is feeling to also push for this ceasefire to get the hostages out. And while trying to do all of that, maintain his position that the U.S. is still a staunch ally of Israel. But he does have all of these people in his ear communicating to this. There is some internal deliberation about all of this this as well, even with some of his top aides pointing this out to him. But he is the driver of this strategy, and it will truly only be up to him to say, I haven't seen Israel do enough, and now we could start to condition some of this military aid, which, by the way, Katie, it's not like Israel really necessarily needs it. They have much of the weaponry that they need to do what they say they are going to do. So there's also the question of what is the point of continuing to send some of these bombs, and to see what potentially down the line could also be sent when it comes to weapons. It's a larger question here for this relationship.
Well, it could also be a question of how Israel is seen to be allied with the United States, and whether if there's a breach in our relationship, whether they might be seen as more vulnerable in what is already a pretty hostile region. Monica Alba, Jake Sherman, Ashley Parker, thank you very much.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.